Well, we have a little task ahead of us here. I'd like to share a little bit from the conceptual world of the Gospels unfolded in the pages. We find that Jesus adapts the very symbols of Israel's religion and the symbols evoked in the Old Testament, and shapes them in new ways and transforms them from something that they were to something brand new. Of course, when we look at the track of Jesus' ministry and his life, beginning in Galilee in the north and then moving to the south in Jerusalem, as the three gospels suggest, um, we see that Jesus slowly undermines some of the core symbols of the faith. And of course, this will easily explain how it is that Jesus can go from the anticipated Messiah to the one who will be pinned to a cross. When you start to agitate one another, you begin to find that this is part of what happens. And so um, we looked at what happens with the story when Jesus begins to mess with the critical story that's on offer. And the way that we looked at it, um, we said that when Jesus begins to unfold a little bit of what it means to be in this position, people began to get uncomfortable. They begin to get uncomfortable with the way Jesus. And I think the thing that we would say is the if we had the picture in front of us of Uncle Sam, say, or if we had the picture in front of us of some of the characters that we know, and Jesus began to upend those kinds of images, it would have an effect. And so when we look at the symbols of the faith, we see that Jesus transforms those as well. So the first one we want to look at is how Jesus transforms the idea of a restored land and a restored people. So Jesus is offering a vision of what God is doing as Jesus offers the people this new way of looking at people themselves. Now, let's see if I can make this just a little bigger for us on the screen. And so Isaiah 35 is a passage that deals with some of this. When you look at Isaiah 35, this is the highway passage, which is really wonderful. It describes a new way. Look at how it says here: the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad; the desert shall rejoice and bloom. Notice the very images connected to the land itself. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong and do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. So the judgment of God is invoked here. The land has been blessed, and the land which was so critically important, the land that was promised to Abraham, this land is going to be transformed, Isaiah says. And look what it says here. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, so blind eyes opened. The lame shall leap like a deer, the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. The haunt of jackals shall become a swamp, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. A highway shall be there, it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fools will go astray. Imagine where you don't even need your phone to get to a place because it's the glory of God will draw you right there. Nothing unclean. There will be no one who is excluded from this road. Look at verse 9. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord will return. So this is a key piece, this verse 10, beginning with the restored land, then we move to the restored people on that land. This is all from Isaiah 35, coming to the critical moment here in verse 10. The ransomed of the Lord. This is a very important word that becomes used in the New Testament. Jesus will use this word. The Son of Man comes to give his life as a ransom for many in Mark's gospel. Now, Jesus doesn't explain what that means, and that throws us off a bit, but Jesus does use this image. So here come the ransomed of the Lord who are returning. Is it their ransom from their hardships? Are they ransomed from a foreign power? Are they ransomed from their exile? All of those answers seem to be in play. Of course, those answers are yes to all of them. In the New Testament, the way that the New Testament the Gospels read it is that the ransom is from sin itself. So the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion. That's Mount Jerusalem, the mountaintop of Jerusalem, the center of the city where the temple was. They shall come to Zion with singing; everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. What a powerful invitation to join on this road. So Jesus, he knows this passage, of course, and he understands that now he looks at himself as the vehicle on which God will be restoring all things. The Gospel of Mark is the gospel that is the road story. It's a gospel that um, describes the discipleship process, that is following Jesus all along the way. If you remember from reading the Gospel of Mark, it begins as a travel narrative, and Jesus travels from Galilee to the south. And in a climactic moment, blind Bartimaeus, who is healed at the end of chapter 10, and it says, and Bartimaeus followed Jesus all along the way, rather than go home, where he had, Jesus tells him to go home. In typical Gospel of Mark fashion, you're not supposed to listen to Jesus. And so Bartimaeus then turns and heads to follow after Jesus, and the word is all along the way. So Jesus is, and of course Bartimaeus is blind, one of the key aspects that we see in Isaiah 35. The lame are going to be healed, the blind will see, and the deaf will hear, and these are all aspects of human life that would have precluded someone entering the temple to participate in the worship liturgy and the sacrifice, thus procuring forgiveness of sins. So now that Jesus offers this to people, it is in a way channeling the energy of this restored land. And again, Jesus focuses that upon himself. In the parallels between Matthew 11 and Luke 7, John the Baptist sends his disciples to ask if Jesus really is the Messiah. And how does Jesus reply? He says, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind are seeing, the lame are walking, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are being raised up, and the poor are hearing the good news. And blessed is the one who's not offended by me." So clearly, Jesus is doing the things that awaken our reader's sensibility that the prescription in Isaiah 35 is coming to pass. At the same time, though, Jesus doesn't have a theology of place like the leaders had. This is something I think that we fail to recognize. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem one time. In John, Jesus goes to Jerusalem three times. But there isn't any kind of sacred space that sets Jerusalem or the temple apart. In fact, Jesus reserves his harshest judgments in the Gospels for the places that were supposed to be most holy. So, so Jesus doesn't necessarily have a theology of place like he says. In fact, Mark 13 is the most incredible spot. It says the person comes to share with Jesus about the temple. And let me show you what it says in Mark 13. Well, I would love to show you, but I typed wrong. What's for some reason it's not working here. There we go. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." That is a question, that is a statement meant, that's a softball pitch. That's a here, Jesus, here it is, hit it. He comes out of the temple and he says, "Look at these large." Now, if you've been to Jerusalem to see the temple or to see the Temple Mount, the one wall that remains standing, you can see the stones are absolutely enormous, enormous. In fact, it's really hard to believe that the rest of the temple structure fell down, given what the construction looked like. I mean, fire notwithstanding, um, but some of the stones are about half the size of a city bus. I mean, you're talking giant stones to fortify this wall. So the disciple gives Jesus a chance to talk about the sacred space of the temple. And look what Jesus, how he responds here. And you can tell because it's written in red. That's how you know it's Jesus. He says, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Now, if you read somebody like, uh, you know, Wilhelm Freda or Albert Schweitzer, or more recently, people like Marcus Borg or John Dominic Crozon, they're going to position this saying within the complex of sayings that were made by the gospel writer in advance of the fall of Jerusalem. In other words, because it portends too much to the future, some of those scholars believe Jesus couldn't have said it. But if you take a different, even if you are suspicious about Jesus's omniscience for reasons that are your own, it's not implausible to suggest that it would be torn down, given the contentious nature of the way that things were and the way that you people could see the difficulty ahead. It wouldn't have been a big stretch to suggest, if you keep antagonizing the power broker, at some point that thing's going to come down. So I just point that out to just kind of gently push back on those who say, well, just because it looks like something that's going to happen in 70 AD as opposed to 33, it couldn't have possibly been said. People say all kinds of crazy things, as we know. So Jesus does not have a theology of place, and that's very different from his co-religionists of the day, who did have a theology of place embedded in the promised land and the temple and those kinds of things. Abraham was told that he would inherit the land, and so from the promised land has been an absolute necessity among Jews for the practice of the faith. Now, the second thing Jesus fools with is the notion of family itself. Jesus goes out of his way to create a fictive kinship or a surrogate family around himself. So he has 12 disciples, and that is supposed to awaken a sense of the 12 tribes. Now, when you see Mark 3:31 through 35, that's a very interesting passage when Jesus is teaching, and all of a sudden it says that his mother, his brothers and sisters show up, and they're trying to take him away because they deem that he has gone crazy. And what does Jesus do? He sits and he opens his hands and he looks at the crowd and he says, "You who do the will of my Father, who hear my voice, you who do my will, you are my mother, my brother, my sister." Um, this is not just, and I've heard this said about this, that it's a fictive kinship, right? That Jesus is redefining brother or sister. And sometimes when we go to Christian churches, they'll call themselves brother or sister. and sometimes it might make you uncomfortable, but this is where it comes from, that Jesus announces that these will be the his brothers and sisters from now on. I don't know that it was fictive. I mean, it might be fictive where you and I are concerned, but one time I went to a restaurant with a dear friend, and we were at the restaurant, and the server came up to our table to help, and she said to my friend, "Are you here with your grandson?" And he looked at her and he said, "Oh no, we're closer than kin," is the way he put it. Which kind of she turned her head a little bit, and she said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he said, "Oh no, we're family. We're in God's family together." And that was I didn't forget that. That was an interesting way to put the consequence, right, to what Jesus is announcing here. In addition to those kind of experiences for the redefined family, and if you think about the redefined family that Jesus offers, it cuts against most of the sensibilities in Judaism. Just as a reference point, there are two genealogies, one in Matthew and one in Luke. Both of them depend on family line to succeed and move. So this is part and parcel about what it means to practice the faith, is to preserve the lineage that started with Abraham. Jesus opens that up though to whomever he extends an invitation. Even the Gentile is given a chance. One aspect where that comes to be very clear is when Jesus has open table fellowship. He celebrates this messianic banquet with those all the wrong kind of people, right? So Zacchaeus, he has dinner at Zacchaeus's house. He has fellowship with the wrong sorts of people, and they know it. Why the Pharisees say, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus celebrates with them because he is bringing folks on that road. Isaiah 35. Here we go. Everybody is in, and that's the difference. For the Jews of the day, it seems like maybe they were more interested in permitting, gatekeeping who could go and who wouldn't go on that road that would extend into God's family. And Jesus centers all of these new family relationships upon himself. So allegiance to Jesus was to override all the other relationships. You get a sense of that when you have the person who comes up to Jesus and says, "Jesus, I'll follow you. What do I have to do?" And Jesus looks at him and says, "Sell everything you have, leave your home, and follow me." And the person looks at Jesus and he says, "Well, I have to bury my father first." And Jesus looks at him and says, "Let the dead bury the dead." And those kinds of things, when Jesus says that kind of stuff and it's recorded for you in the Gospels, that always makes me nervous. How could Jesus say such a thing in a delicate position where a person is in grief? And I've read commentaries that suggest that, well, what Jesus was really talking about was the 1 year period of grieving that a family did when someone passed away, prior to collecting their bones and putting them in the family crypt. Well, that's a nice theory, but what if the man's grief is very fresh? It seems like Jesus has been insensitive. What the gospel writers are trying to approximate is just how far allegiance to Jesus extends, and it's Jesus without any close second. So Jesus has redefined the land, he redefines family, he redefines Torah as well. Torah defined Israel. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also called the Pentateuch. Those 5 books are called the Torah. In the Torah, we have sections related to the practice of faith, membership in the community, what rules and guidelines are offered to the community for the purpose of keeping the community set apart for God. The Torah was the fence, if you will, that allowed the people to be constituted the way God had offered. So Moses receives the covenant. This is the way that the document reads, and then the people in the community begin to exercise their their interpretation, right? So Torah defines Israel in every way: membership, conduct, mindset. And this is where the Pharisees began to have sort of the Pharisees began to push the limits of the strict interpretation by encrusting the law, or that's not the best way to put it, but let's say the law is here in this center point. Well, the Pharisee wanted to try one aspect of Pharisaism seems to have been, there's a big giant book on the Pharisees that's been released that's far better. But it does paint a very difficult picture to follow, because much of our information about the Pharisees has come through layers of anti-Semitism and mistrust and false characterization. We understand all that, so we're careful in how we characterize the Pharisees. Jesus had Pharisees in his group. Nonetheless, one of the commonly understood uh, elements of Pharisaism was their desire to preserve the Torah and the law. And part of preserving it was identifying ways that a person could not break it. So if the law is here, then there would be things that would go in, almost like fences around which, if you couldn't get past this, there's no way you could break the one in the middle. So if you stick to this one over here, then you can't break the one in the middle. I'll give you an example. We're traveling in Israel. We it was on the Sabbath day, and we were told the elevator on the far right was the Sabbath elevator, and I didn't know anything. And so I asked what was the Sabbath elevator, and the person said, "Oh, the Sabbath elevator on the Sabbath day stops at every single floor, so the person inside the elevator doesn't have to push the button. Pushing the button was what constitutes work, and so they don't want to break the Torah, so it just stops at every floor." So I took the stairs, and let me tell you that 10 stories is a long way to hike up the stairs. Nonetheless, the point is, not risking the commandment to work on the Sabbath requires an estimation of what work is. And so we define it in a way so as to not allow it to be broken. I have no problem with that. I think that's a sometimes we look at that, we say, "Oh, that's quote unquote legalistic." It was therapeutic for the community. It may have gotten to the point where it was pushed beyond its limits, but this is what Jesus comes along and just upends in some key ways. Now, let me show you some of those key ways. You can find them if you're taking in Matthew's gospel. The best place to look here is the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 5. And so that doesn't help if you spell the book wrong. That's not going to be helpful to us. And so here are the beatitudes that Jesus shares. The beatitudes, you recall, sure do look a lot like the 10 commandments, organized in similar ways, very kind of standard formula. And then Jesus gets into this section further on in which he clarifies his own role vis-a-vis the law of Moses, the Torah. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill." Now, that would seem to indicate that Jesus is going to present a much more rigorous approach to the law. He says not one letter, not even a punctuation mark can be omitted from the law. Don't break these commandments. And so he's unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Some people see that particular passage as a response to Pauline Christianity, where Paul seemed to relax keeping the law. Here, Jesus said it's going to be even more strict than the Pharisees. But notice here how Jesus he's talking to people. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times." I always like when Jesus says ancient times. Um, "You shall not murder." That's a quote of the 10 Commandment, right? "Whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment." So this is where Jesus strengthens the command. It's not just not murdering. It's those who have bad thoughts about their brother or sister. A second example you may find here, he says again, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So the motivation remains critical. Jesus will do that through this section. And you can read Matthew 5 through 7 for more examples. And what Jesus is doing, you see, is strengthening the Torah, but Jesus is acting like the authoritative interpreter. He's acting like the one greater than Moses, the one who can inform the community about how the Torah is to be kept. Now, when you start messing with fundamental symbols like this, it's going to raise an eyebrow. Jesus then focuses his announcement about forgiveness of sins upon himself. Remember in Matthew, when the person is dropped from the roof and he looks at him and says, "Your sins are forgiven," and everyone goes crazy. And he says, "So that you know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said, "Take up your mat and walk." And the guy gets up and walks out. So Jesus even centers forgiveness of sins on himself, thus just dislodging not only the place of the temple, right, which is going to come, the temple's the next symbol that Jesus fools with, but then also the notion that the Torah's prescriptions, uh, Jesus is basically undermining the authority of the Torah's prescriptions. I suggest you're not gonna fare well if this is going to be the way things kind of progress. People are going to be upset. So the next piece, the next symbol Jesus fools around with, of course, is the rebuilt temple. It's interesting. This is the one charge that sticks in the Gospels. He said he would destroy this temple and then raise it back up. Now, if Jesus could do that, I think you can find pictures of what the temple would have looked like in the ancient world in Jerusalem at the time. It was a huge structure. It was impossible for one person to do that. Now, in Zechariah 8, you have the announcement that people were to fast while the temple was undergoing its cleansing. And as long as Israel considered itself to be in exile, the fasting would continue as the temple was in disarray. The idea is when people return from exile, the temple would be cleansed. So fasting continued in Jesus' day. But Jesus announces to everybody who asks, specifically around the areas of kinship we already saw, why does your master, why does the teacher not fast? And he says, why you don't fast while you have the bridegroom with you. In other words, you don't fast while I'm here because I am going to be the culmination of all those promises. I mean, it's hard to overstate just how disruptive such claims might be. You can see you can see that if you look at the parallels, and let's take a look at Mark 2, just so we have a frame of reference here. So let's take a look. It's going to be Mark 2, verses 18 through 22. So let's forward down. Let's forward to verse 18. John's disciples, so that's John the Baptist and the Pharisees, were fasting. That's doing without food, going without it, in prayer instead. And people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't?" And Jesus said to the guests, the wedding guests cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them. And so they can't fast as long as the bridegroom's there. Days are going to come, though, when the bridegroom's taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth onto an old cloak, otherwise the patch pulls away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost. So the skins, but one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. So these parables, those little pictures paint it so that Jesus concentrates and puts himself in the spot where he is the new wine. He is the new patch. He is the newness that is authoritative. He's the next thing that God is doing to put the world to rights. And that supersedes the issue of the temple itself. And this had to enrage those who were really passionate about these symbols. And people can get passionate about the things that they really believe in. I mean, we've seen sports teams change their names and people go crazy. Can you imagine how passionate people would have felt about the temple? And here comes Jesus advocating for certain positions that seem to undermine it. This is why we have to get rid of the notion that Jesus comes along as kind of like a purveyor of peace, or like your exercise instructor who's constantly positive. I mean, this Jesus was he was coming with a definite edge. So he symbolically reorients even the temple around himself. And you can look up those passages, since one will be fine, Mark 12. So N.T. Wright, in his book Jesus and the Victory of God, suggests this can only mean one thing. The kingdom behavior in which Israel's basic confession of faith is truly fulfilled is worth more than the temple and its sacrificial system. And since Jesus was claiming to offer the renewed heart, the blessing of the new covenant through which people would at last be able to keep the Shema, that's Deuteronomy, Hero Israel, the Lord your God is one, and all of the things that they were told to do. Um, you should read the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, in verses 4 through 6. Um, by loving their God and neighbor indicates that for Jesus, part of the point of the kingdom would be that it would bring with it all that the temple offered. Jesus is bringing the substance of the temple to bear in himself. And the upper room is a test case here. In the upper room, we're going to turn to Mark 14. The upper room is this place where Jesus gathers for the Last Supper, Mark 14. And as he gathers here in this place, um, let's see. As he gathers, let's make sure I got the right passage so I can. So, verse 17. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. And they began to be distressed and to say to him, one after another, surely not I. You've seen this in Da Vinci's painting, the disciples leaning in one to the other, asking, is it him? Is it me? Who is it? It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me, for the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. And while they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to them and said, Take, this is my body. Then he offered a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. This provides the disciples with a whole new framework in which to evaluate the two critical symbols of bread and wine. Bread and wine were key elements in the Passover meal that Jesus adjusts in order to convey a new reality to the people, that it's no longer going to be the bread that's offered within the temple, but he has become the bread. It's no longer going to be the poured out wine and a drink offering. It's going to be Jesus himself who is the offering. And so this is how Jesus refashions this stuff. Now, not to be missed is the way that Jesus also um, comes along to offer a re-evaluation of Messiahship. And the meaning of Messiahship in Judaism and early Christianity is really something that Jesus also upends. In the Maccabean revolt in 163, independence gives everybody a chance to think. And part of what happens there is that The liberation against the Seleucids achieved by the Maccabeans, and then the Hasmonean dynasty purchases about 100 years of independence. Yet still, there was a feeling, especially after Pompey the Great arrived, that Israel was still under the thumb of Rome, and therefore the full exile had not yet come to an end. So the temple becomes a key factor in the kingship in Israel from David on. So there's a close relationship between temple and Messiah, between temple and king. And so Zerubbabel, he restores it. Maccabeus cleanses the second temple. Herod rebuilds it. Even Bar Kokhba, many, many years later in 135 AD, goes back to that place and stands there. That temple and Messiahship go right together. In early Christianity, Christians insisted on calling Jesus the Messiah, even though it was plain that this could be seen as Roman and could be antagonistic to Rome, and could further more Jewish misunderstanding. There's no attempt on the part of the early church to change the way it's spoken. In fact, even though Jesus is not physically present, they still use the terms Messiah, Jesus Christ, Christos, and they still announce the idea of a kingdom. So so there is no real, like, if you go into a place and you say, okay, what give me some example texts that really show what a Messiah looks like. Well, you don't really have that. You don't have that. Instead, you have actions specifically related to the cleansing of the temple. And when you look at Zechariah 9 for an Old Testament precedent, Jesus may have been performing a Maccabean action as a way of announcing his own position. He comes in riding on the donkey and then proceeds after he makes his way there. This is uh, the Palm Sunday narrative, and he gets there and everybody throws their coats down. This is where you have a series of little puzzles that are embedded in the gospel message. So Jesus says, if you destroy this temple, I will rebuild it. Well, how is in what world? And he begins to, for those of us on the inside, we get to understand some of these symbols. But those on the outside, you can see that this could only be antagonistic. When Jesus says, if talking about faith, say to this mountain, be removed and thrown into the sea. I mean, the mount that Jesus is looking at is the Temple Mount. And the idea that you could say to that mountain to be removed and thrown into the sea was not borderline, it was totally sacrilegious. Again, we go back to John the Baptist and his request, are you the Messiah? And Jesus reflects back and channels back that Isaiah passage. The deaf hear, the lame are walking, and the blind see. What does that imply? It indicates Jesus' authority and authenticity, but also shows how different his notion of Messiahship was from the rest of the culture, even including John the Baptist, who may have thought Jesus should have been recruiting some folks to carry weapons. The parable of the tenants and servants. This is a particular. Now this goes to N.T. Wright's his specific interpretation of some of these parables, and you can look for it in the book Jesus and the Victory of God. What is interesting, though, is that Jesus, in the telling of the parables, does position himself as the one who will be taken and killed. That is something running through these parables. So somehow or another, Jesus has self-awareness about what his role will be and what the end result will be. So somewhere along the line, Jesus has adopted Isaiah's message with the specific context of Isaiah 52 and 53 in mind, where Jesus will adopt for himself the persona of the suffering servant. Um, I'm going to just skip this for just a little bit because it depends on a Hebrew word and an Aramaic word, and that may not be that helpful to convey in the sense of a video. Maybe more to the point is his talk about when they're asked if it's lawful to pay taxes, and he says, "Bring me a denarius." He's looking at Caesar, and I think you may have seen a denarius. It even says Divi Filius, DF, at the top corner on the reverse sides of these denarii, and that means son of God. Therefore, the Roman emperor is evoking a sense of connection to divinity, and Jesus himself is looking at that, and he says, "Render to Caesar what is was Caesar's, and render to God what is God's." And so Jesus comes in such a place as to evoke Psalm 96. Give unto Yahweh, you families of the peoples. Give unto Yahweh glory and strength. Give unto Yahweh the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. O worship Yahweh in the beauty of holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the heathen, Yahweh is king. And if Yahweh is king, then Caesar can't be. Jesus' words push back against any kind of Jewish compromise with the kind of foreign powers. And this was fair game for the Sadducees. In the trial scene in Mark 14:55 through 64, the entire trial scene seems to be one of a comedy where there's one view of Messiahship, and that view of Messiahship is totally mistaken on the part of those who are participating in the trial. All the process of the trial, the sentence, the identity, all the blasphemy, all that stuff. Jesus is accused of threatening to destroy the. How can he do that, right? Caiaphas' question reveals another riddle. So, but Caiaphas, in the meantime, kind of admits that Jesus would be the Messiah. It's almost comedic. Jesus is claiming to be the representative of the true people of God, and so in that declaration, Israel's God, Jesus anticipates that Israel's God will vindicate him and bring not only the destruction of the temple, but also the the reclamation of the people of God. Of course, Jesus is accused of blasphemy. He sets himself against the temple. He claims to be exalted to sit at the right hand. He says this right to Pilate: "You will see the Son of Man." How is that not to be interpreted as a other than blasphemy? Um, and he claims that he'll come on the clouds, evoking Daniel 7:13. So this is the charge. The charge is that Jesus is a false prophet, but you see, there's no real straight ahead response. What is clear is that Jesus' notion of his own messiahship doesn't fit with the expectation of the crowd around him. They expected a military, political, even a priestly Messiah, and instead Jesus comes along as one who locates the temple um, functions in himself by forgiving sins and by healing and making clean. Jesus redefines family around himself, no longer tying those things to the lineages that were so popular and so essential. Jesus redefines the Torah himself and around himself. So all of these things are open to being misunderstood and misinterpreted on the part of Jesus's contemporaries. Without question, when you start messing with symbols, you start messing with the things that people hold on to most dearly. I don't think there's a better time to illustrate that than our own, where the symbols of politics have been upended and people claim certain things about the symbols that seem to be alien, especially if you just compare them to the way people talked about those same symbols 25 or 30 years ago. In short, Jesus adopts the mindset of a suffering Messiah, something that could not have been foreseen among those Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, and the crowds of the day. But in hindsight, the disciples all recollect Jesus' statements about this. And in fact, in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus, Jesus, as his resurrected self, comes and he says to the people on the road to Emmaus, let me do you some study as we go through the Old Testament. And he says, show you how it was necessary that the Messiah should suffer and then be raised from the dead. So those are some thoughts about the symbols and how Jesus upends these symbols, centering them on himself, and then ending with a quick look at the kind of messianic figure that Jesus was. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you down the road.